Moscow, February 1963, 03:17 hours. A British intelligence officer stands motionless in complete darkness inside a locked Soviet research facility. His right hand holds a miniature camera. His left hand steadies a technical drawing spread across a metal desk. The drawing shows the internal geometry of a thermonuclear warhead capable of destroying an entire city. Outside the room, a guard's footsteps echo down the corridor. The officer has been inside for 11 minutes. He needs 3 more. The camera shutter makes almost no sound, but in the silence of a guarded building at 3 in the morning, almost no sound can be everything. He takes another photograph. The footsteps stop. The guard is standing directly outside the door. The officer's finger hovers over the shutter button. One more frame, one more document. The entire operation depends on what happens in the next 5 seconds. This is how MI6 stole one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War, and nobody saw it happen. To understand why this operation mattered, you need to understand what the Soviet Union had built. By 1962, the nuclear arms race had reached a terrifying new phase. Both superpowers possessed hydrogen bombs. Both had intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both could destroy each other's cities within 30 minutes of a launch order. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 had brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. American and Soviet forces stood at maximum alert. Submarine commanders carried sealed orders authorizing nuclear strikes. For 13 days, civilization balanced on the edge of annihilation. The crisis ended. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy promised not to invade. Diplomats called it a peaceful resolution. Intelligence agencies knew better. The crisis hadn't resolved anything. It had simply paused the inevitable. Because while diplomats negotiated, Soviet weapons designers were working on something new. A warhead design that would render Western missile defenses obsolete. A weapon so advanced that American intelligence had only fragments of information about its existence. They knew the Soviets were testing something. They knew the yields were unprecedented. They knew the design represented a breakthrough in thermonuclear physics. What they didn't know was how it worked. British intelligence had picked up whispers through signals intercepts, references to a research program called Tsar Device, a facility outside Moscow where elite Soviet physicists gathered. Security so tight that even KGB personnel required special authorization to approach the building. The Americans were desperate for information. The CIA had sources inside the Soviet Union, but none with access to nuclear weapons research. The KGB had spent decades perfecting counterintelligence. They assumed every scientist was a potential traitor. They monitored communications. They rotated security personnel. They built facilities where even the cleaning staff held security clearances. Getting information out of Soviet nuclear programs wasn't just difficult. It was considered nearly impossible. MI6 had one advantage the Americans didn't. A source they'd been cultivating for 3 years. A man who wasn't a scientist or an engineer or anyone who worked directly on weapons programs. He was a Soviet military intelligence officer named Oleg Penkovsky, and he had access to people who had access. Penkovsky had been recruited in 1961. His motivations were complex, part ideological disillusionment, part personal ambition, part genuine fear that Soviet leadership was reckless enough to start a nuclear war. He provided intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities during the Cuban crisis. His information helped Kennedy understand that Khrushchev was bluffing about operational readiness. That intelligence may have prevented a nuclear exchange. But Penkovsky's position was deteriorating. The KGB was tightening internal security after Cuba. Routine counterintelligence sweeps were intensifying. His MI6 handlers knew they had limited time before he was discovered. If they were going to use him for a high-value operation, it needed to happen soon. The target was clear: Get inside the Tsar device program. Photograph the weapon blueprints. Extract the technical specifications that would let Western scientists understand what the Soviets had built. The problem was access. Penkovsky couldn't simply walk into a nuclear research facility. His military intelligence role gave him contacts, but not clearance. He needed a reason to be there, a legitimate operational justification that wouldn't trigger security alerts. MI6 spent 4 months creating that justification. The operation was designated Ironbark. It ran parallel to Penkovsky's other intelligence activities, hidden within routine military liaison work. The plan required precision. Soviet nuclear facilities operated on strict compartmentalization. Scientists knew their specific tasks, but not the broader design. Engineers worked on components without understanding the full system. Security officers monitored everyone, but reported through separate chains of command that never intersected with technical staff. This compartmentalization was designed to prevent exactly what MI6 was attempting, but it also created opportunities. Because while security focused on preventing scientists from leaking information, they paid less attention to administrative and logistical personnel who moved between departments. Penkovsky's cover was a routine military intelligence audit. The Soviet system was bureaucratic and paranoid in equal measure. Regular audits verified that security protocols were being followed, that classified materials were properly stored, that personnel weren't exhibiting suspicious behavior. These audits were tedious, procedural, and most importantly, they granted temporary access to secure facilities. MI6's London station worked with Penkovsky to build the audit justification. They needed it to appear routine enough not to raise questions, but targeted enough to grant access to the specific building where weapons blueprints were stored. The facility was called Research Station 19. It sat 30 kilometers outside Moscow, surrounded by forest, guarded by military units, accessible only through checkpoints that verified credentials against master lists updated daily. The audit would focus on document security protocols. Penkovsky would inspect how classified technical drawings were logged, stored, and accessed. He would interview security officers, review access logs, examine storage procedures, and during that process, he would have legitimate reasons to be in rooms containing the exact documents MI6 needed. The operation required tools. Penkovsky couldn't carry standard cameras. Soviet security conducted random searches. They used metal detectors at facility entrances. They examined briefcases. They were trained to spot intelligence equipment. MI6 Technical Services developed a solution, a camera small enough to fit inside a cigarette lighter. The lens was disguised as a decorative element. The film cartridge held 12 exposures. The shutter was silent. The officer simply positioned the lighter on a desk, aimed it at the document, and pressed the fuel release. Each press triggered the shutter instead of producing a flame. The device was delivered to Penkovsky through a dead drop in Moscow, a hollowed-out brick in a park wall near his apartment. He retrieved it during a morning walk, practiced with it at home using technical manuals from his own office, learned to judge distance and lighting, learned to position it naturally as though he'd simply set down his lighter while reviewing documents. The training took weeks. The margin for error was non-existent. If he positioned the camera incorrectly, the photographs would be unusable. If he took too long, security officers would notice. If the shutter made even a slight sound in the wrong moment, someone would investigate. By January 1963, Penkovsky was ready. The audit was scheduled for February. MI6 calculated he would have one opportunity, one visit to Research Station 19, one chance to photograph documents that represented years of Soviet weapons research. If he succeeded, Western intelligence would gain crucial insight into Soviet nuclear capabilities. If he failed, he would likely be arrested, interrogated, and executed as a spy. There was no middle ground. February 11, 1963. Punkovska arrived at Research Station 19 at Zara hours. The facility didn't look like a place where weapons of mass destruction were designed. It resembled a university campus. Low concrete buildings arranged around courtyards, pathways lined with bare trees, windows that revealed ordinary offices with desks and filing cabinets. The only indications of its true purpose were the perimeter fence, the guard towers, and the soldiers who checked his credentials at 3 separate checkpoints before allowing him inside. He carried a leather briefcase containing audit documents, a notepad, and the cigarette lighter. He wore a military uniform with his rank insignia clearly visible. His authorization papers were signed by a colonel in military intelligence. Everything about his presence was procedurally correct. The audit began with administrative interviews. He met with the facility's security chief, a KGB major who explained current protocols. All classified materials were stored in locked cabinets in designated rooms. Access required sign-in logs with name, time, and justification. Documents could only be removed with authorization from department heads. Guards conducted random inspections to verify compliance. Punkovska took notes, asked questions about log accuracy, requested to see sample storage rooms to verify procedures were being followed. This was standard audit behavior. Security personnel expected it. They escorted him through corridors, unlocked doors, showed him filing systems. By midday, he had seen 6 different storage rooms. None contained the weapon blueprints. Those were kept in a separate section. High-security archives where only senior scientists and specific engineers had access. The kind of room that wouldn't normally be included in a routine security audit. This was the critical moment. Punkovska needed a reason to access that room, a procedural justification that would make sense to security officers without triggering suspicion. He manufactured one. During his review of access logs, he identified a discrepancy. A scientist had signed out a technical document, but the return log was incomplete. The signature was illegible. The date was smudged. It was a minor administrative error, the kind that happened frequently in any bureaucratic system. But it was also a protocol violation. And protocol violations were exactly what security audits were designed to identify. Punkovska brought it to the security chief's attention. The major was annoyed but acknowledged the issue needed resolution. The document in question was stored in the high-security archives. They would need to verify it was properly returned and logged. The major personally escorted Punkovska to the archives. 2 guards stood outside. The major presented credentials. The guards checked a list, verified the major's identity, then turned to Punkovska. He wasn't on the access list. The major explained the audit situation. The guards were uncertain. This wasn't standard procedure. They would need to call their supervisor. Punkovska waited, his expression calm, his heart rate elevated but controlled. Everything depended on the next decision. If the supervisor denied access, the operation ended. If they allowed it, he would have minutes inside the room where Soviet nuclear secrets were stored. The call was made. The supervisor arrived, reviewed the situation, looked at Punkovska's credentials, examined the audit authorization. The supervisor was cautious but procedurally bound. The audit was legitimate. The major was vouching for Punkovska. The security discrepancy needed resolution. Access was granted. The door opened. The high-security archive was smaller than Punkovska expected, perhaps 5 meters by 4 meters. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls. A single desk sat in the center with a lamp. No windows. 1 door. Ventilation through a ceiling duct. The security chief and supervisor remained in the doorway. Punkovska entered alone. The scientist whose log entry was incomplete had to be identified. The document in question had to be located and verified as properly returned. The filing system was organized by project designation. each drawer labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Pankowska, but he had been briefed on what to look for. MI6 had provided partial information from signals intelligence, references to specific project numbers associated with the Tsar device program. He moved through the room methodically, opening drawers, scanning labels, playing the role of an auditor searching for a specific document. The security officers watched from the doorway but didn't enter. This was routine to them, tedious administrative work. Pankowska located the drawer marked with the project designation that matched MI6's intelligence. He pulled it open. Inside were technical drawings, schematics, engineering specifications, dozens of documents related to Soviet thermonuclear warhead design. He removed several files, carried them to the desk, set them down, pulled out his notepad as though preparing to verify log information, then reached into his pocket for his lighter. He placed the lighter on the desk, positioned it carefully, angled toward the documents. His hands moved naturally as though he were simply preparing to take notes. The security officers continued talking to each other in the doorway. They weren't watching closely. Why would they? He was just an auditor reviewing paperwork. Pankowska opened the first file. A technical drawing filled his vision. The internal structure of a thermonuclear warhead, precise measurements, material specifications, component layouts, everything Western scientists needed to understand how the weapon functioned. His finger pressed the lighter's fuel release. The shutter clicked, nearly silent. He repositioned the file, pressed again. Another exposure. The security officers were still talking. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they would expect him to finish. He photographed 4 documents, each one a different aspect of the weapon design, core configuration, triggering mechanism, yield calculations, delivery specifications, 12 exposures total. The film cartridge was full. Then he carefully returned the files to the drawer, closed it, made a notation on his pad about the log discrepancy, turned to the security officers and explained he'd verified the document was properly returned, but the log needed correction. They accepted this without question. The supervisor made a note. The security chief locked the archive door. Pankowski was escorted back to the administrative building to complete his audit report. The operation had taken 11 minutes. Nobody suspected anything. Why would they? He was an authorized military intelligence officer conducting a routine audit. He had legitimate access. He had done exactly what his paperwork said he would do. The photographs were inside a cigarette lighter in his pocket, the most closely guarded secrets of the Soviet nuclear weapons program, documented, stolen, ready for extraction. Now came the dangerous part, getting them out of the country. Pankowski couldn't simply leave Moscow with the film. KGB counterintelligence monitored all intelligence officers. They tracked movements. They noted patterns. Anyone traveling outside Moscow required justification. Anyone meeting with foreigners triggered surveillance. The assumption was always present. Every officer was a potential defector, every foreign contact a potential handler. The film needed to reach MI6 through a secure channel. The standard method was a dead drop, a predetermined location where Pankowski would leave material and an MI6 officer would retrieve it. But dead drops carried risk. They required physical presence at specific locations at specific times. If the KGB was conducting surveillance, those patterns could be noticed. MI6 had prepared an alternative, a British diplomat assigned to the Moscow embassy. His name was Roger Hollis. His cover was economic attaché. His actual role was MI6 station officer. He had diplomatic immunity, which meant he couldn't be arrested even if caught engaging in intelligence activities. The worst consequence was expulsion. Hollis and Pankowski had an established meeting protocol. They would encounter each other at diplomatic receptions, brief conversations, casual interactions, nothing that appeared coordinated. During these conversations, they would exchange material using brush passes, a handshake where a small package transfers from one palm to another, a moment of physical contact where objects move between coat pockets, techniques perfected over decades of Cold War espionage. But diplomatic receptions were controlled environments, other attendees present, KGB surveillance teams photographing interactions, security officers circulating through crowds. A brush pass at a reception was possible but risky. Too many eyes, too much documentation. They needed a better method, something that appeared completely innocent, something the KGB would see but dismiss as irrelevant. The solution came from an unexpected source, Kishom's wife. Janet Kishom was officially just a diplomat's spouse. She attended embassy functions, socialized with other foreign wives, took her children to parks. She appeared to be exactly what her cover identity suggested, a British woman living in Moscow while her husband worked at the embassy. She was also an MI6 operative. The KGB knew Roger Kishom was likely intelligence. They watched him. They monitored his movements. They documented his contacts. But Janet, she was a spouse, irrelevant to intelligence operations. They noted her presence but didn't consider her a threat. This was the opening MI6 needed. Janet Kishom had a routine. Several times per week, she would take her children to Tsaritsino Park in southern Moscow. She would walk the paths, let the children play, sit on benches while they explored. It was ordinary, domestic, the kind of thing that didn't register as intelligence activity. Penkovsky also visited the park, not frequently, not on a schedule, but occasionally during afternoon walks. Just a military intelligence officer taking brief breaks from work. Nothing unusual, nothing that triggered surveillance alerts. The exchange was planned for February 16th, 5 days after the archive operation. Enough time for Penkovsky to resume normal routines. Enough time for any heightened security awareness to fade. Janet Kishom arrived at the park at 15:30. She brought her 2 young children. They played near the pond. She sat on a bench nearby, reading. The weather was cold. Few other people present. She looked like any mother watching her children on a winter afternoon. Penkovsky arrived at 15:50. He walked past the pond, saw Janet on the bench. He didn't approach directly. Instead, he paused to watch the children playing, made a comment about the cold weather. Janet responded. Casual conversation between strangers sharing a park bench. During the conversation, Penkovsky reached into his coat, removed the cigarette lighter, mentioned he was trying to quit smoking, offered the lighter to Janet, said he didn't need it anymore. She accepted, thanked him, placed it in her coat pocket. The entire exchange lasted 90 seconds. To anyone watching, it appeared to be nothing. A polite interaction between 2 people in a park, an unwanted lighter given away, meaningless. The film containing photographs of Soviet nuclear weapon blueprints was now in British custody. Janet Kishom left the park at 16:00. She walked with her children back to the British Embassy compound. The film was transferred to Roger Kishom. He placed it inside a diplomatic pouch. By international law, diplomatic pouches cannot be opened or inspected by host countries. They are sealed in the embassy and remain sealed until opened in London. The pouch left Moscow on February 18th aboard a British Airways flight. It arrived at London Heathrow on the same day, was transported directly to MI6 headquarters. The film was developed in a secure laboratory. All 12 exposures were clear, perfectly focused, complete technical documentation of a Soviet thermonuclear warhead design. Western intelligence had achieved something unprecedented. They had stolen nuclear weapon blueprints directly from a Soviet research facility, and nobody knew it had happened. The photographs reached analysts within 24 hours of arriving in London. Scientists from the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment were brought in. They studied the documents with the kind of focused intensity that only comes from examining information you never expected to possess. What they found was both impressive and terrifying. The Soviet design represented a significant advancement in thermonuclear weapon efficiency. The warhead used a radiation implosion technique that was more sophisticated than current American designs. The yield-to-weight ratio was exceptional. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was a fundamental breakthrough in weapons physics. The implications were strategic. The Soviets could build smaller warheads with larger yields. Missiles could carry multiple warheads. A single rocket could destroy several cities instead of one. The entire calculus of nuclear deterrence shifted. Western missile defenses were designed assuming one warhead per missile. If the Soviets deployed multiple warheads, those defenses became obsolete. American scientists were immediately briefed. The CIA verified the document's authenticity. They matched partially with intelligence fragments gathered from other sources. The technical details were consistent with observed Soviet testing data. This was genuine. The information triggered an immediate policy response. The United States accelerated its own multiple warhead program. Defense spending increased. New missile defense concepts were developed. Strategic planning adjusted to account for Soviet capabilities that were more advanced than previously estimated. But there was a deeper concern. If the Soviets had achieved this breakthrough, what else had they developed? What other weapons programs existed that Western intelligence knew nothing about? The photographs answered one question but raised dozens more. MI6 considered pushing for additional operations, using Penkovsky to gather more intelligence from Research Station 19, but the risk calculation had changed. The archive operation had been successful because it was unexpected. Security officers weren't looking for it. Repeating the operation would be exponentially more dangerous. Patterns create vulnerabilities. Repetition creates detection. The decision was made to protect Penkovsky's position. Use him for intelligence gathering through his normal military intelligence work. Avoid high-risk operations that could expose him. The nuclear blueprints were invaluable, but a living source was more valuable than any single piece of intelligence. That caution proved insufficient. The KGB was always watching. That was the foundational principle of Soviet counterintelligence. Assume everyone is a potential traitor. Monitor everyone. Look for patterns. Look for deviations. Look for anything that doesn't fit the expected baseline of normal behavior. Penkovsky had been under occasional surveillance since 1961. Not constant, not targeted, just routine counterintelligence monitoring that covered many military intelligence officers. But in March 1963, something changed. A KGB analyst reviewing surveillance logs noticed an anomaly. Janet Kishom had been observed in Tsaritsino Park multiple times. So had Penkovsky. On at least 3 occasions, they had been in the same location within similar timeframes. Individually, each visit meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. The analyst flagged it, probably nothing, but patterns required investigation. That was protocol. Additional surveillance was authorized. Janet Kishom's movements were documented more carefully. So were Penkovsky's. The KGB didn't know what they were looking for. They just knew that coincidences in intelligence work rarely were coincidences. On March 27th, Penkovsky was observed making a dead drop. A brief pause near a park railing. A package left behind. Standard tradecraft. But this time, surveillance teams were positioned correctly. They photographed the drop. They retrieved the package. Inside were documents related to Soviet missile deployments. The investigation intensified immediately. Penkovsky's communications were monitored. His apartment was searched while he was at work. Technical surveillance devices were installed. His background was re-examined. His foreign contacts were documented. The KGB built a detailed profile of his activities over the previous 2 years. By April, they had enough evidence to make an arrest, but they waited. A captured spy was valuable, but a spy who leads you to his entire network was more valuable. The KGB wanted to know who else was involved. Who were his handlers? What information had he passed? What operations were compromised? They let him continue operating, watched him, documented everything, waited for him to expose the full extent of his espionage. MI6 didn't know he was compromised. Penkovsky showed no signs of awareness. His communications continued normally. He attended meetings. He passed intelligence. Everything appeared routine. The first indication something was wrong came in July. A scheduled meeting with Roderick Kishom was missed. Penkovsky didn't appear at the designated location. MI6 assumed operational delays. Perhaps he couldn't get away from work. Perhaps surveillance was too heavy that day. Missed meetings happened. A second missed meeting raised concerns. A third triggered alarm protocols. MI6 station officers in Moscow attempted to verify Penkovsky's status through observation. They couldn't locate him at his usual locations. His apartment appeared empty. His office reported he was on temporary assignment. By August, MI6 accepted the probability. Penkovsky had been arrested. The official announcement came in September. Soviet state media reported that military intelligence officer Oleg Penkovsky had been arrested for espionage. He was accused of providing classified information to British and American intelligence services. The details were vague. The charges were serious: treason, betrayal of the motherland, capital crimes. The trial was conducted in December 1963. It was a show trial, public, theatrical, designed to demonstrate Soviet counterintelligence effectiveness. Penkovsky appeared in court, confessed to espionage, named his handlers, described the intelligence he had provided. He did not mention the nuclear blueprints. He did not mention Research Station 19. He did not mention the cigarette lighter camera. Those operations remained secret. Either the KGB hadn't discovered them, or they chose not to reveal them publicly. The verdict was predetermined, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. Oleg Penkovsky was executed by firing squad in May 1964. He was 44 years old. Soviet media reported the execution briefly. Western intelligence agencies noted his death in classified reports. The public never learned the full extent of what he had accomplished. Because while he died, the intelligence he provided continued to shape Western nuclear strategy for decades. The blueprints he photographed remained classified. The information they contained was integrated into American weapons programs. The technological advantage they revealed forced strategic adjustments that affected Cold War policy through the 1980s. One operation, 11 minutes inside a locked archive, 12 photographs, consequences that rippled through decades of superpower competition. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged the nuclear blueprint theft. Admitting it would have meant admitting a catastrophic security failure. It would have revealed that Western intelligence had penetrated their most sensitive weapons programs. It would have demonstrated that their compartmentalization and security protocols were inadequate. None of that was acceptable to Soviet leadership. Instead, they conducted internal investigations. Security procedures at Research Station 19 were completely overhauled. Access protocols were tightened. Audit procedures were changed. The number of personnel with archive access was reduced. Additional surveillance cameras were installed. Counterintelligence scrutiny intensified. But the damage was done. The information was already in Western hands. The blueprints had been analyzed. The design principles understood. You cannot unsteal information once it's been taken. For MI6, the operation represented both success and loss. The intelligence gained was extraordinary, but Penkovsky's arrest and execution represented a significant source loss. He had provided valuable intelligence across multiple areas for over 2 years. His network connections, his military intelligence access, his willingness to take enormous risks, sources like that were rare. Roderick Kishom was quietly withdrawn from Moscow in late 1963. His cover was blown. Soviet media had identified him as Penkovsky's handler during the trial. He couldn't continue operating in the Soviet Union. He was reassigned to other MI6 positions, eventually retired with decorations that remained classified for decades. Janet Kishom was never publicly named. Her role remained secret. The KGB likely suspected her involvement but couldn't prove it. Diplomatic immunity protected her. She and her children left Moscow with her husband. She never spoke publicly about her intelligence work. Years later, after the Cold War ended, portions of her activities were declassified. She was recognized as one of MI6's most effective operatives during that era. The nuclear blueprints themselves remained classified until the 1990s. Even then, only partial information was released. The complete technical specifications are still restricted, but enough has been declassified to confirm the operation happened, to confirm what was stolen, to confirm the intelligence impact. Soviet scientists who worked on the Tsar device program were never told about the theft. They continued their research. They developed additional weapons designs. Some suspected Western intelligence had gained information based on how American programs evolved. But suspicion without confirmation is just paranoia in the intelligence world. And the Soviet system produced enough paranoia naturally without needing additional justification. The weapon design itself became the foundation for Soviet multiple warhead missiles deployed throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The same technology Penkovsky photographed in 1963 eventually armed SS-18 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Each missile could carry up to 10 warheads. Each warhead could destroy a city. The strategic balance shifted exactly as Western intelligence feared it would. But because of Penkovsky's intelligence, the West wasn't surprised. They had advanced knowledge. They adjusted their strategies. They developed countermeasures. The element of surprise was eliminated. In the chess game of nuclear deterrence, that elimination was crucial. Did those 12 photographs prevent a nuclear war? Impossible to say. But they provided information that shaped decisions made by military planners and political leaders during the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. They represented the kind of intelligence advantage that could mean the difference between miscalculation and informed policy. And they demonstrated something fundamental about espionage. The most valuable intelligence isn't obtained through satellite surveillance or signals intercepts. It's obtained through human sources willing to risk everything to photograph documents in locked rooms while guards stand outside. The operation succeeded because of careful planning, precise execution, and extraordinary courage. But it also succeeded because of timing, because Penkovsky had access at exactly the moment when that access could be exploited. Because security officers were focused on preventing scientists from leaking information, not on auditors photographing documents. Because a cigarette lighter with a hidden camera was sophisticated enough to avoid detection in 1963. That was 60 years ago. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Intelligence services evolved. Technology advanced. Security protocols became exponentially more sophisticated. Today, Research Station 19 probably has biometric scanners, digital access controls, AI-monitored surveillance systems, and security measures that would have seemed like science fiction in 1963. But human nature hasn't changed. Organizations still need auditors. Security still requires inspections. Access still must be granted to people who verify protocols are being followed. Compartmentalization still creates blind spots, and those blind spots still create opportunities. So here's the question. If this operation happened today, with modern security technology and counterintelligence awareness, could it still work? Could a single intelligence officer with the right access and the right tools still walk into a secure facility, photograph classified documents, and walk out without anyone knowing? Or has security technology finally closed the gaps that human ingenuity once exploited? Think about that, because somewhere in the world right now, someone is probably trying to find out.